In 1972, one of the most impactful games was invented and released by Nolan Bushnell, Pong. At the time, it was the first video game to grab wide-scale public attention, and the game was adored by people of all ages. Since then, video games have evolved in almost every single way. Compared to the earlier days, games in general look better, sound better, are better controlled, and have greater ambitions because of the larger amount of available resources and funds. However, some of the most beloved and popular games of all time were made by individuals that did not have as much support for them. These games are sometimes even more polished than the ones that a major game studio releases. So how is this possible? What makes an indie developer different from a major game studio? Why do indie games oftentimes have a different feel than AAA games? How are games developed in the first place? All that and more on today's episode of The Rundown.
What's up, guys? Welcome to episode 2 of The Rundown.
I'm Will.
I'm Sam.
Today we're joined by our friend William Foster.
Excited to be here.
Today, we're going to talk about video game development, indie games versus AAA games, and a bunch of other related topics.
Let's get into it.
All right. Game development, how it all starts.
Yeah. And I think for most games, generally, there's like 3 main stages. So there's like pre-production, and then there's production, and then there's post-production. And usually there's like other smaller stages in between, such as like planning, testing, marketing, launch, and all that. And something I think that we see a lot in the games that we play is a kind of iterative development type of strategy, where basically development teams like move in cycles of design, build, test, and so on. And they like start releasing small amounts of content and like patch updates for their game.
Right. I think that type of development is really good and very helpful for the game development teams, because it allows for the players and the community to sort of get in there and test the game before it's really fully completed. And then they have an opportunity to be giving feedback, to be saying, we could try this, we could try that. Oh, we'd love to see this. And at the end of the day, games are products, and they're meant to be consumed. And the consumer's right. So
I think that early access and test servers are both good ways to get your game out there before it's completely done, and to get feedback so that on release you can prove it
Yeah,
out.
I was thinking that because I think test servers especially for like multiplayer games, is like a really valuable thing that a lot of development teams use. Like if you think of like Overwatch, they have like the Overwatch test server, where basically it allows for like the team to put out a lot more, I guess, like riskier like changes to their characters before they actually put it into like live servers and see like what the impact is.
right, it's the type of stuff that could be very game changing. It could change the way the game's played, change up the style, the pacing, and like you said, maybe it's too big of a change to just put right into the live version, and they want to talk to the players, test, see what they have to say about it, and get some feedback before going straight to the real game.
Yeah, because I think if they didn't have test servers, then like a lot of things they would just have to like theorize about like what would happen if they made a change. And there's probably a lot of things like variables that they can't predict, and like a lot of results that they don't see coming.
Yeah, for alpha and beta testing too. I mean, that's just a way to like test your servers and test the game, because the development team is relatively small compared to the mass consumer population.
Right, and just for a little bit of context there, the difference between sort of alpha and beta testing, what these basically mean is they're early stages of the game. So you start off with your very bare bones version of the game, which is often referred to as beta.
I think the alpha is first. I think it.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
the alpha
really?
is first. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So then the bare bones stage of the game is your alpha development of the game. So during an alpha test, you select, usually a very small number of people who are very interested in the game, who have been on waiting lists and such like that, to come test it. The companies know that these will be, some of the more dedicated fans with opinions that could really, be impactful and matter. And then the next phase is usually beta. A lot of games will skip the alpha phase and go straight to a beta phase.
It's usually like a bigger sample size of like players that they pick
Right,
to
absolutely.
get feedback from.
Before then releasing into a full live version.
Yeah, and I think something that's like connect to this that like you mentioned earlier a little bit is like early access is something else that a lot of games use in order to like it's like just another way to get feedback and end up like helping in them like develop their game. And I think that there's actually an issue with early access in some games that are like released today, because there are some examples of games that were like put out as early access games when they didn't really have a lot to offer yet. Like it didn't really have things like the game wasn't almost finished, and it maybe might have like lacked a complete system that had some pretty obvious missing features that they say that they're gonna put in later, but it's not there when it's released in early access. And it could just be like it's not an entertaining game yet. And because I think usually what the ideal kind of like situation is if you put out a game that's bare bones and doesn't have a lot yet, but it's like a really strong foundation, and then you get feedback from players saying like what they want in the game and like what unique features they're looking for, and then you start putting those unique features in after, then you can start building up your game into something that's like that like stands out and is high quality.
Right. I think that in a lot of cases where you most commonly will see something like an early access sort of build is on these smaller indie games on Steam. So just to be clear, indie games are games that are being developed by very small companies, sometimes even one or two, maybe three people. They're usually a little bit more like art-oriented, labors of love type things.
Yeah.
That can take more creative directions than some of the AAA huge budget studio games. And I think a big reason for that, why we see so many early access titles releasing under the indie category, can be that in a lot of cases, when you only have 2 or 3, maybe 5 or 6 people to work from with these small teams, there's only so much that you can pull from in terms of like ideas about directions you want to take the game. And so I think it's a very easy solution for a lot of these companies to then turn towards their communities and say, listen, our game, this is a really good first impression. This is what our game's going to be like, but we are asking for your help to sort of stick it through, develop the game with us a little bit. And I think that there's a lot of great gameplay that can come out of that, a lot of fun for you watching a game grow. But I think also there can be a couple pitfalls with that.
Yeah. So to tie up what I was saying earlier, I think one of the most important rules for like video game development, especially in like today's market, is that you never get a second first impression. And when you put a game out as early access, even if you like constantly remind players that it's early access and that like more content is coming and then that like it's not finished yet, they're not gonna care. It's basically like a release, like a formal release. Because like especially in like I said, today's market for video games, there's a lot of like repetitive concepts and like ideas. So if your game only stands out like maybe like a tiny bit, but it looks like super similar to every single a bunch of other games that are also on the market, a player is like not gonna feel the need or feel the want to like help you build it and evolve it into something that's like even more unique. And like maybe it could end up being like a really good quality game, but players aren't gonna feel the want to help you make it into that if it's not like already showing a lot of promise and almost complete.
Right.
For sure. And I can also think of examples where it's the complete opposite, where an early access game is actually very close to being finished when it's released. And I think of like Grounded, which is almost a fully fleshed out game, but it's still in early access.
Right, and that goes along with a game like Fortnite, for example, that released in early access, and I believe it is still in early access.
I think it's fully released.
I think now it is.
But it remained in early access for a very long
throughout the height
time.
of its popularity.
And really nothing changed that was significant or game altering. I mean, little additions here, new things to keep the game popular and exciting. But what was released was really what you get. And I think that's a fairly popular sort of idea. Yeah. I think it's very rare that the foundation of the game changes during the early access and development period. I think it's more of like the skeleton remains the same, but maybe the meat and the muscles change a little bit over time or are added.
Yeah,
sometimes
it definitely is like a really rare situation, but An example I can think of is for The Culling, which was like a battle royale game that came out in 2016, and I think it was early access. And when it first came out, it was heavily praised, and it had like a really dedicated, large fan base because it had a lot of unique features that made it stand out from the other like similar genre of games. But then they started making changes, a bunch of major changes to like the fundamental designs of the game, like how the combat worked and like a bunch of other things, and that ended up like turning the audience and their like fan base against the game. So I guess like the point I want to say here is the fact that sometimes if a game goes into early access like too early, and they keep messing around with like what the foundation and like what made fans dedicate their like or like and what made fans want to become dedicated to the game and like basically fall along with it as it evolved in the first place. If you accidentally stray too far from like the original vision, then that can end up like backfiring.
I think that really ties into being loyal with your fan base.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of bigger AAA companies and these big industries really take their fans for granted sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, and I think of companies like Activision or EA, which just pump out these games like every year, and a lot of the content is hidden behind a paywall or something, and it really just, I don't know, makes you feel like you're not being appreciated as a fan.
Yeah.
Right. I think something that we see with some of these big games, right, is you fork out $60 to play this big AAA game. It looks beautiful. The visuals are something that could only come from, a huge studio with thousands of people working on it. And then you start playing the game only to find that, half of the content is locked behind a paywall, and you have to, all of a sudden pay more money. You lose, I think, a lot of the respect that comes with being like a loyal fan. And no matter what happens in that case, that can't feel good to think that this company, you really look up to them and the games that they make, and then all of a sudden they sort of screw you a little bit.
I think something else that kind of ties in with like publisher that you mentioned, like Activision and everything, how they release games yearly. I think that one of the biggest, I guess, something that can be really valuable for an upcoming game is like the length of time fans have to wait before the game releases, because I can think of like 3 major examples of games that kind of had like a really large group of dedicated fans that are like anxiously waiting for any news of the games and like waiting for the games to release. It is Breath of the Wild 2, Hollow Knight Silksong, and Elden Ring. And Elden Ring came out like pretty recently, but before it came out, it also had like a super dedicated fan base that just like were waiting for it. And all 3 of these games I think got like announced in 2019. And I think these games kind of are examples of how fans become more and more invested, and like the excitement can build before a game's release, if done correctly.
Right. Yeah. I think that this is a huge part of one of those core principles of like game design and the process that you mentioned earlier, and that being the marketing aspect. Because there's a lot of ways to market a game. You can look at the face value, like judging, the cover of the game, looking sort of that classic idiom, don't judge a book by its cover. That's a very common way of trying to pull people in, looking very flashy from the outset, get some interest going in your game. Another big one for these bigger companies are these long-term sort of early announcements, and you draw things out and get fans really excited. I think, though, that one of the caveats to this method is that all 3 of the games that you mentioned come from really very successful studios, and they are all the sequel or sort of next step
like
from the follow-up for very, very popular games. Breath of the Wild 2 coming from Breath of the Wild, a widely popular Switch game. Hollow Knight Silksong coming from the original Hollow Knight, one of the most beloved indie games of all time. And then finally Elden Ring, coming from the studio that practically invented the genre. And so that does build a lot of expectation. But I think that with these companies that really have mastered the previous game, I think that the reason why that strategy is so successful is because that people know what they're getting into by following it.
I think that since they all came from their own franchises and like they already had a whole big giant fan base following them, that kind of made them maybe feel more comfortable when developing it. But it's also a whole lot of pressure.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you have a whole lot of pressure to deliver to your dedicated fans, and I think that sometimes it's hard to meet those expectations, and that kind of builds into false promises and building expectations too high and not being able to deliver.
I think that also just adds the fact that like while waiting, like the wait for a game to come out can be valuable, but it can also end up backfiring
Right.
if the wait becomes too long.
Right.
Because for a game like Cyberpunk, it had a very long wait time for like any news of the game to come out, and then it ended up getting delayed like another 3 or 4 times. And since the wait time got super long, the fans that were really excited for it, basically like their excitement kept growing, but eventually ended up becoming like resentment almost, or like just indifference when they like didn't really care anymore because it was taking so long to come out.
Right.
And when it finally did come out, a lot of fans were kind of disappointed with what was delivered because of like the amount of time they had to wait, and how like expectations for the game kept growing and growing, and also how you were saying how like when the company keeps making promises of things that are gonna like happen, and then like fans see like a delay happen, for example, and they can think like, oh, they must be working on something super big. They like get it into a perfect condition before like it releases.
Right. And then just for a little bit of context there, because I think that this is a very important event in the gaming community in general. Cyberpunk 2077 was a huge hugely announced,
yeah.
Really big
hugely
announcement.
anticipated game, done by a very big AAA studio. It was
CD Projekt
CD
Red.
Projekt
Yeah.
Red.
And they already had like a really popular franchise, The Witcher.
Yeah.
Right, and so The Witcher was a really very popular game. The third iteration actually won Game of the Year a couple years
Yeah,
ago. I
I
think
think, yeah.
2016. And so Cyberpunk 2077 is a role playing game. So it's open world. You play as a character. You have tasks to go do. But the thing that was supposed to set it apart from the wildly oversaturated genre was the studio promised groundbreaking visuals, amazing innovative gameplay. I mean, essentially what they said in their own words is that they were going to change the marketplace. They
Yeah.
were going to change the industry, change the way people see games, like change the perception, what could be possible. And after 5 or 6 delays, just overworked staff, and all these empty
False
promises,
promises,
they released a practically unplayable game.
Yeah.
I remember like I was all over the news that the new PlayStation 5, a console built from the ground up practically to run these new generation of games, was unable to even
couldn't load the game.
Yeah.
right even on like the lowest settings, where the game truly looked awful, unlike anything that was promised. And so it was all recalled, all refunded. The project lost a huge amount of money, and even now, after tons of development, tons of sort of bug fixes and stuff.
They're still trying to recover from that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and even though like it's playable now, and objectively speaking, the game is pretty high
It's
quality.
in a pretty good state now.
Yeah, it's just, but like fans of the game don't really care because like the first impression was so bad, and also just the fact that they underdelivered so much after like such a long wait and build up of like.
And I think even now it doesn't meet all of its promises.
Yeah, it
that
doesn't.
it made. I remember watching trailers for that game, and what I thought was like the coolest part was how all these people in the city, like all these little NPCs and bots, were walking around and had their own
Yeah, that
lives,
was like
and
part
it was
of
all
the
like this AI and stuff.
features.
Yeah, and I thought that was, I don't know, it was like so revolutionary because I was so used to RPG games having these characters that just have like these set specific paths they walk on, and having characters that could walk around like they were real people was so cool to me.
Yeah.
Right. But when you have issues like cars falling to the floor and trying to
Coming
drive
from the
them,
sky and stuff.
yeah, and falling
Cars,
out of
like
the
flying
sky
everywhere for no reason. Yeah.
there's no time to notice the parts of the game that they worked on. And I think that this is a huge pitfall of a game developed by a huge studio with these huge expectations, is that there's parts of the game that you can tell had a lot of time put into them. There were parts of the game that you could tell that specific branch really worked hard, put a lot of themselves into it, but it's just so marred by the other aspects of the game that made it really unplayable. That at the end of the day, it didn't really matter much.
And I think Cyberpunk is also just like an example of a game that released like too early.
Right.
And the reason they released so early and felt like the urgency to release it that early is probably because of like the building pressure.
Right.
Since they announced the game so like also so early.
They were trying to get it out by the holiday that year.
Yeah.
But they couldn't do it, and they released it way too early.
They released it when it wasn't ready.
And everyone agreed, I think, that they should have just taken their time and released maybe a year later.
I think that this kind of goes back to your point earlier when you're talking about games like Hollow Knight, Silk Sonnet, talking about Breath of the Wild 2, Elden Ring, these games that are widely anticipated. But the fact that at some point you reach a tipping point with that, and that anticipation can turn into, impatience and really very negative emotions that are no longer beneficial for the game studio. And I think that because of just how hard CD Projekt Red was pushing this project, it just created so much space for people to over anticipate and to be unable to really wait longer. So I think that despite people saying, oh, in hindsight you should have waited, I think that they stood a lot to lose no matter what.
I think that a game that released really well and I think met everyone's expectations and delivered more was Elden Ring.
Elden Ring.
Because they released maybe like a short gameplay trailer of the game like maybe a year ago, and didn't give very much since. And then they released maybe a small beta test about a month before the game came out, and it was just the very beginning area, and everyone was already blown away by the game.
Right.
Yeah.
They were trying to build a little bit of hype
Just
before the
little by
initial
little,
release.
and then they released, and it was way more than anyone could have seen coming.
Yeah, I think
Right,
that,
versus doing hype building events and PR events, months and even years before the game is even remotely ready, like in Cyberpunk.
I
case.
think like Elden Ring is probably like an example of like what like the best case scenario would be, because I would imagine when they announced the game, it was probably already pretty far in development.
Yeah.
And they felt that like they were gonna be like ready soon, that it wouldn't take like a very, very long time for them to keep working on it before it can release. And also just the fact that like, when the excitement of the fans kept building up and up and up, and then they ended up like meeting those expectations and going like above, it just ended up making it like
It felt
considered
special.
like one of the best games of all time.
Right, yeah.
And I think I think the genre of indie games in general probably have a lot easier time of dealing with things like wait time, because they have like they don't really have
The
I guess,
same,
like-
yeah.
like-
they're not on the same schedule as bigger.
like
studios.
bigger studios probably feel a much more bigger need to like keep pumping out games and keep like putting out content for their fans to like stay dedicated and focused and like want to keep playing.
But I think that when you get to indie games, I think a really common theme is that all of a sudden it's less about the business side of things.
Yeah,
It's less
exactly.
about making the money. It's less about putting out a product that follows the formula that people will like. I mean, it's like the same thing. Like you think about when you go to the movies, right? And you go watch the new Marvel movie. It's a set pattern. Marvel knows exactly what they're doing. They know what people like, but at the end of the day, it's not transformative.
Yeah.
It's not an experience that you'll come away with like being a little bit changed by. And then as opposed to something like now a more famous indie director, Wes Anderson, is a good example of someone who puts out much fewer movies, but each one of them is sort of a unique masterpiece in its own way. And even if you don't necessarily enjoy the movie, even if you don't necessarily see what the hype's about, you can still kind of understand just by looking at it and seeing what other people have to say that there's something inherently a little bit different. The budget might not be there, the outstanding visuals might not be there, but at the end of the day, it's like a labor of love. And the same thing is true in game design. With these indie games, the visuals, the graphics, the CGI, it could never, hold a candle to these multi-million-dollar budget games with thousands of people working on them. But a lot of the times what they lack in visuals, they make up for in soul.
Yeah, I think like adding on to when you mentioned like Marvel movies, I think part of why or I guess like for Marvel movies, every single time they release, most likely they objectively are getting better and better, but because they like release so in such a short time frame, there's not like enough time for the excitement to build up, and there's not enough time for fans to get like really invested before it releases.
Right.
And that's like the same thing with a lot of modern game series, like Assassin's Creed or Call of Duty, which kind of like release yearly or like every other year, and they start to feel repetitive or like underwhelming, even if they are getting better, just because of the fact that it's like it starts feeling formulaic.
Right, the density and the quantity of
Yeah.
them.
I think it's about like kind of putting something out that you know people will buy. I think of like the Halo series. Halo 1 through 3 was all made by Bungie Studios.
Yeah.
But then the project kind of got canceled and revived several years later. But they brought in a new studio, 343.
Yeah.
And people felt like the whole soul of the game really changed, and it was just putting out something that they knew people would buy because it's the new Halo game and
Yeah.
reviving an old series.
And I mean, Halo 1 through 3 were like some of the most
They're masterpieces.
masterpieces,
Yeah.
some of the most important games in the history of game design. I mean, they really created and solidified a whole genre of gaming. And I think Bungie was a studio, more so I think back when those games were being made than it is now, that was a very like, dedicated studio that cared about the product more than, the income. And of course that's always there. It's part of the business. I mean, you're creating a product, but a good product is something that people really love, not just that they'll buy.
Yeah. And I know Halo 3, when it was being developed, got pushed back so many times. Like, I think it got pushed back like 2 or 3 years being developed because they wanted to put out something they knew was good and was going to be like the capstone to the whole series.
I think something related to that is just the fact that like in general for indie games, they are a lot more willing to like be innovative and be experimental and take more risks that like these big major companies can't kind of afford to take.
Mm-hmm.
Right, absolutely. And because there's no, board, there's no, process they have to go through to get approval for things. These people working on these indie games, these small teams, they can, just go, limitless places with what they want to do. If they have an idea and they say like, this is how I want this game to be, then that's how they can make it. They're not bound by the rules of the company or the rules of what they think people will like. I mean, obviously they're trying to design a game that will become successful and be fun to play. But there's so much room for them to do their own thing and to really sort of create more of an artwork than just a video game.
Yeah, I think a really good example of that is Minecraft when it got released.
It's hard to talk about indie games without talking about Minecraft.
Right? Yeah, because when it first was released as like a really bare bones alpha by I think Marcus Persson, is that his name? Yeah. It was super basic, but fans like saw the value in it and saw the charm and like really liked the concept and idea of it. And when he released it, he was just like by himself. He worked on the game all by himself, and he didn't have a team yet. And after kind of just like keep continuing to work on it and continuing to build on the game, eventually he was able to found his own development studio for it, Mojang Studios, and now it's like become the most popular game of all time, best-selling game of all time.
And like, yeah, it's crazy that you can just start off by making a game in your basement and then slowly build up, and that's what he did with Mojang. And then eventually, I think 2018, somewhere, I don't know, a couple years ago,
I think
they sold Mojang to Microsoft for over $1 billion.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think that Minecraft is an example of a game that like was always about the fans.
Yeah.
I can't think of a time when Minecraft or the Mojang studio in general ever did anything for the sake of money. I mean, they never made it Minecraft 2.
Yeah.
They never took all the ideas they had to make Minecraft better and made a different game that you had to purchase again. They created, every time that they had something that they thought could make the game better, they put it in.
Yeah, and it was also like just free updates and more content
I
for
think
many, many years.
Throughout Minecraft's lifetime, they've always been so concerned with keeping the soul of Minecraft intact.
Absolutely.
And they don't want to pump out they have the budget and they have the capabilities to put out a crazy new content that's like ridiculous and would change the game, but they don't want to. They want to keep the soul and keep Minecraft to what it's always been, which is just kind of calm, chill, building,
Yeah. And I think kind of adding on to, or I guess moving on to into a different direction, I guess. I think there are an example of a game that example of a game that kind of had a lot of things, we kind of talked about Cyberpunk. For another example of a game that promised to deliver a lot of things and showed a lot of promise, but then ended up like dying out, and that's something that happens to some games. They end up like becoming dead and no one plays them anymore. Is Evolve.
Right.
And Evolve was a 5-player game that was supposed to have 4 players playing as like as hunters and one as the monster. And basically it was like the hunter's goal is to eliminate the monster, and the monster's goal is to go around consuming the wildlife and then evolve their abilities and end up either defeating all the hunters or destroying the objective. And before release, the game was praised heavily because it had a really unique concept that had a lot of potential, and also just the fact that a lot of critics, I guess, saw value in the gameplay and thought it was really fun. But when it released, it instantly got a lot of criticism for like how its progression system worked and how it had a really light narrative and how the gameplay ends up becoming super repetitive and boring. And I think the biggest reason the game died, I believe, was just because of on release they had so much like additional DLC.
Right.
And I think it was like, to buy an additional monster, an additional character, basically it was $15 for one character.
Right. Which is as much as you might pay for an
A
indie
game. Yeah, like an indie game. And then there was also just like about $130 worth of like additional cosmetic content that wasn't even included in something like the season's pass, which is like usually a bundle that includes everything.
Right.
So it was just like so much, and it became so obvious that the game was like
Just
a money grab. Yeah.
I remember I played Evolve 1, and I remember that gameplay being so unique and so much fun, but it did feel very repetitive very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think that like you had the core values and the core like gameplay there in the foundation, but they didn't really know where to go with it.
Yeah, and then like the game ended up, I believe it transitioned to becoming free to play, and then they ended up shutting down the dedicated servers for the game in 2018. And that's like an example of how a game can end up becoming dead, like unplayable almost even.
Right.
And there's like a lot of other examples of this, like I think Battleborn and like Lawbreakers are both games that have had their like dedicated server shut down.
Lots of hype around them, and then it just all disappears.
Yeah, so it's like another path that a video game can end up accidentally like following.
Yeah. I think another really great example of that is Splitgate, which was set to be like a really, new age, revolutionary FPS game, because the genre is so oversaturated as it is, because there's only so many ways you can spin a shooter. And what they did is that they decided they were going to add portals. Not a unique idea necessarily, but the pair I think was really unique. And there was a lot of hype over it. People were excited for this new sort of style, this new level of gameplay. And despite all of that, it was pretty much dead on release. I mean, right from the get-go, the servers were fairly empty. And
I feel like everyone downloaded it and played maybe an hour or two, and then forgot about it.
And it just stopped.
Yeah.
I think if you want to move on now, there's a topic that I think we kind of forgot to touch on earlier when we talk about video game development, is development hell.
Right.
Which is something, it's not exclusive to video games. That happens to a lot of like all forms of media, like music, film, and everything. But for video games, I think it's especially prominent because usually it involves things like switching between different like crews, different scripts, different game engines, or like studios, or just like scrapping everything you have so far and restarting. And it's like a pretty big problem for a lot of games.
Right. So just basically summed up very simply, development hell is pretty much just the stage a game gets to, like you said, where either something major is being like switched in the middle of things, like whether that be a new studio, whether it be, a complete rewrite of the script, a complete redesign of the game. But it's just something that stops the game from releasing, something along the way. And oftentimes if that happens, it sort of creates like a cycle of happening. And very often
usually the game just stays in development for like a very, very, very long time. And there's like a lot of examples of this because I know LA Noire was like a detective game released by Rockstar Studios. It started development in like 2004 and it released in like 2011, 2012 or something. And there's like a lot of examples of games like this where it's just like it takes like maybe like 10 to 11 years to develop and release, just because of the fact that they keep like building onto something that they can work with, and then it ends up like getting scrapped.
Right, and then Team Fortress 2. Oh no, sorry, Team Fortress 1, I believe. One of the biggest shooter games of all time. I think it created a genre in and of itself in some ways. Took 9 years to release. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and to work on a game for 9 years, and I mean, Valve, the studio behind Team Fortress, was already an established studio at that point, I believe. And so they had the experience, but still, like, I guess at the end of the day, it was worthwhile considering they made such an amazingly successful game. But it just tells you that, like, even with these big studios, sometimes it can take a while to get the games fully
it's just
developed.
like yet another thing that could end up happening to like a video game in development by accident.
There's also Paragon, which that promised a lot. That was like supposed to be a third-person MOBA type game. Or was it like 5v5?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and it was like you go around the map and has so many different abilities and stuff, but
Right.
that just kind of got caught in a loop of, I don't know.
Yeah, it promised, if I remember correctly, sort of like the culmination of like 3 or 4 of the most popular genres of game all at once, and all of these being multiplayer competitive style games. And they wanted to sort of say, okay, well, here's 3 things that everybody really loved. What if they were one thing? And what ended up happening is it would release very, very, very early release. People would shut it down, like the fans. The project would be dropped, a new studio would pick it up. It would be dropped, a new studio would pick it up. I think now even there's this new studio working on Paragon, and it's being released under a new name.
I think Paragon itself got canceled a while ago, but they released all their assets online.
Okay. I see.
Oh, right.
And so they kind of put them all out there for free so that people who were dedicated and wanted to rebuild the game from scratch could, which I thought was so cool.
That
they
was
did
weird.
that because they were like, okay, well, we've put so much time and effort and it's all gone into nothing. So we might as well keep the spirit of our game alive.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I guess like the last thing I guess we can touch on is just, since like I guess our main focus on this episode was probably like indie games.
Right.
Are there any like indie games that you've played that like you would recommend or think are like really valuable?
Yeah. So if it wasn't clear, my favorite genre of game is indie games. I love playing indie games. I do enjoy the big studio AAA games and all the flashy visuals and stuff. But I find that the experiences I get out of indie games are really something that sort of sets gaming apart for me, and one of the reasons why I still stick around with it. And so if I had to pick 2 games to just touch upon briefly, I would say the first one is a cute little game called Spiritfarer. It's a lovely game where you play as this girl who has basically inherited the role of death. And so you drive around this barge, this ferry, and you go and you collect spirits. And your job is to sort of ease their travel to the other side. So you collect them, you build homes for them, you take care of them, and you travel around the world, and eventually you guide them to the end. And I think that like this is the type of thing that, it's a smaller studio working on it, and every step of the way you can feel the amount of love and dedication that they've put into this, and the fact that they really want you to sit back at the end of this game and say, wow, I think I learned something from that.
Yeah,
and that's special to me.
I think for a game with a concept like that, especially, it can kind of like only work if it's like made by like a indie development team. I don't think like any big major publisher would look at a concept like that and think that can like end up doing really well as like something that has proven already to do really well.
Right, absolutely. It's that level of creative freedom that allows the studio to say, this is what's important to me, this is what we want our game to have, and this is the story we want to tell. Another great example of that is a roguelike game called Hades. It's a wonderful, wonderful game that anyone who likes roguelites, and even those who don't like roguelites, usually tend to enjoy this game quite a lot. You play as Zagreus, the son of Hades, and you basically play out the story of his attempted escape from the underworld on his journey to go meet his mom, who he's never really met before. And along the way, you fight through, the 6 or 7 layers of the underworld, and you meet characters and you develop relationships, and you actively interact with people, and your decisions matter along the way. And I think that when you can be a part of and you can play a story, that's something special in games too. When it's not just, you're not playing the game for the sake of running around and shooting people, or running around knocking balls into a goal with a car. You can really learn something and be part of a story along the way. I think that's something that indie games do incredibly well.
I think a game that I want to mention actually is called A Short Hike, and it's a really small indie game that if you can't tell from the title, it's a really short game, but it is really charming, and it's really fun, and it's full of love from the people that made it. And I think I want to mention this game because a concept that I think, or something that is featured in a lot of smaller indie games, I think, is that it might have it could be an open world type of game, and it could be a really small map, but it can end up feeling really big, and even bigger than some of the big AAA games that have a objectively huge, much bigger map.
Right.
Because I think example of this is Ghost of Tsushima. I think that game has a super huge map, and it has a lot of things to do. But the problem is a lot of the things that you can do in the overworld is that I think there's examples of you can either clear out a Mongol camp, or you can clear out a bunch of Mongol camps around the world, and you can also follow fox spirits to hidden temples or something, or hidden shrines, I think. And the problem with these type of things is that since the map for these big AAA games are so big, they can't possibly keep putting original things to do throughout the entire world, because then the game would take forever to release. It would never come out. And with a game like a Short Hike, in this small world, there is everything that you can do is unique, and everything that you can do doesn't feel repetitive, and it makes you really want to do everything. And I think that the concept of this smaller map feeling much bigger and grander because you are able to get invested into it and feel actually enjoy traveling around in it is something that you can only find in indie games.
I guess a game I would recommend would be Terraria, because that's still a very small indie studio, despite it being a very popular game. And I know when it came out, and to this day, it's still seen as kind of like a Minecraft clone, when it's
not at all.
Not at
really.
all. It's,
Yeah.
Right.
I thought that before I played it too. Yeah.
Right.
I think that a lot of people see it at first glance and think, oh, it's just 2D
2D
Minecraft.
Minecraft.
But I think that game has a whole lot going for it, and a lot of unique concepts, and such an incredibly dedicated fan base. Because the modding community for that game too is so dedicated, and there's so many great mods for that.
Right. Terraria is absolutely an example of a game that has a lot of soul from the creators in it. You can see it in the styling, in the characters, and in the bosses you have to fight. It's just all this incredible stuff that's come straight out of someone's head and just been put right into a game. It's pretty phenomenal.
Is that everything?
Right. I think that's everything.
All right.
I think we're done here then. Thank you guys for joining us for episode 2, and thank you, our special guest, for coming.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I hope everyone joins us next time on episode 3.